All right, so you know how we always hear about these big budget films, the blockbusters,
Yeah, those huge productions.
right? And we kind of just like associate big budgets with great movies.
Mhm.
But what about all those films that kind of like did amazing things with a much smaller budget?
Oh, yeah. It's really interesting to think about how some of like the most iconic films were made on surprisingly small budgets.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. We've got like a bunch of these underdog stories, films that really resonated with people and critics, and they were made on pretty tiny budgets.
And it's like, how did they do that? It makes you wonder. Like,
Yeah.
how did they pull it off?
And I think you'll be surprised at how small some of these budgets actually are,
Yeah.
especially when you think about like how impactful these films have been on cinema.
Like, what were the creative decisions, the things that they had to do to kind of overcome those limitations?
Yeah, before we even jump into specific examples, we should probably like set the stage a little bit. So we're talking about movies that were made for well under $5 million.
Right?
But we also have to think about like the time period.
Yes.
Because like $1 million in the 70s is way different than $1 million in, say, 2009.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You can't just look at the number. You have to think about inflation. You got to think about production costs and all that for those years. And even like technology was different back then. So like something that might have cost $1 million to make in 1960 would cost way more today, even before you think about all the new technology we have for making films.
So like a film like Rocky, which was made for a little over $1 million back in 1976,
Right.
that would actually be like a way bigger budget today if you adjust for inflation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what's really amazing about Rocky isn't just that they made it for so little. It's how they like captured the whole underdog story and it just connected with audiences so well.
Yeah. But what was it about Rocky specifically? Like obviously everyone loves an underdog story.
Right.
But what was it about Rocky that made it work with such a small budget?
Well, they made some really smart choices. Like
Uh-huh.
instead of using expensive sets, they just leaned into that kind of gritty feel of Philadelphia.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So they used real locations to give it like a really authentic feel. Like the fight scenes were even shot with a handheld camera.
Yeah.
And that gives it this raw energy. Like you're right there in the ring with Rocky.
Ah, I see. I see. So it's like they use those limitations to their advantage to
Exactly.
make it better.
Yeah, it made them be more creative. It made them focus on the story and the characters. And those are the things that really connect with people no matter how much money you spend on the movie.
So we see how they did that with Rocky. But what about like horror movies?
Okay.
They rely so much on atmosphere and tension
Right.
and sometimes jump scares. Like how do low-budget horror films get that same feeling?
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting. Low budget horror movies, they have to get creative.
Mm.
They have to use like simple tricks to create that scary atmosphere. Like take Halloween, for example. It was made in 1978 on a budget of a little over $300,000. And it became like this huge slasher film.
Oh, I love Halloween. It's just so simple. And it's not like super gory or anything. It just built that slow, creeping dread.
Yeah.
How do they do that on such a small budget?
Well, John Carpenter, the director, he used a few things. He used lighting and shadows to create a sense of unease, even in places that seemed totally normal. Then there's that music.
Yeah.
He actually composed it himself. It's really simple music, but it's super effective at building suspense and like
Yeah.
making the whole thing scarier.
And that mask,
Yes.
Michael Myers, that's so creepy. And they did it with basically no money. It's amazing how they made such a scary villain with so little.
And that's kind of what great low budget horror does really well. They use suggestion, they let the audience's imagination do the work,
Mhm.
they use sounds, they use the camera in clever ways, and editing to make the scares stick with you long after the movie's over.
So it's like being creative with what you have,
Right.
getting the most out of every dollar.
Exactly. And that resourcefulness, it goes beyond just like the making of the film. Low budget filmmakers have to be really smart with how they market it too.
Oh, that's a good point. You could make a great film, but if nobody sees it.
Exactly. And with a small budget, you can't just blanket the world with ads like the big studios can.
Yeah, right.
So they have to rely on word of mouth and, more grassroots marketing. And a lot of times they'll use controversy to get people talking. Like a great example is the Blair Witch Project. That was made on like $60,000 back
Yeah.
in 1999.
The Blair Witch Project. Oh, man. The shaky cam. Everyone copied that. I remember that marketing campaign. It was so clever. They made it seem like it was real.
Exactly.
Like, is it real or is it fake? And it created this huge buzz online before anyone even saw it.
Exactly. They used the internet, which was pretty new then, to spread rumors and to make people wonder if it was actually real footage. It was brilliant, and it fit the whole found footage style of the film perfectly.
And speaking of found footage,
Yeah.
we can't forget Paranormal Activity.
Yeah.
I mean, that film was made for something like $15,000 in 2007,
Wow.
and it made almost $200 million worldwide.
That's amazing. And again, Paranormal Activity is another example of how low budget can actually make the movie scarier. They used simple cameras, like the kind anyone could have, and natural lighting. So it felt like you were watching someone's home videos.
You know, what's interesting is that both Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity, they both play on this fear of the unknown. That documentary style makes it feel so real and unsettling.
That's right. That realism is key. When you don't have all the fancy effects and polish, you're left with something raw. And that can be a lot more disturbing, especially in horror.
So we've seen how low-budget horror uses limitations to really scare people.
Yeah.
But what about other genres, like comedies or dramas?
Oh, yeah, totally. Think about Napoleon Dynamite. It's such a funny movie. It became this cult classic, and it was made for just $400,000 in 2004. And it connected with people because of those quirky characters and the offbeat humor and just the way it looked.
On Napoleon Dynamite, it was just so simple and relatable. It wasn't flashy or expensive. It just had heart.
Right. And a lot of that charm comes from the filmmaker's passion and dedication. They were willing to make something unique even though they didn't have much money.
It's like that indie spirit, where limitations actually make you more creative.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really interesting thing about low-budget filmmaking, the rise of independent cinema. It's become a real force in storytelling.
Yeah, I feel like some of the best movies lately have been independent films made on smaller budgets.
Yeah, that's right. Films like Moonlight, which actually won Best Picture at the Oscars, and Boyhood, which was filmed over 12 years with the same actors. They were both made on way smaller budgets than your typical Hollywood blockbuster.
Moonlight, winning Best Picture on just $1.5 million. That's amazing. And Boyhood, filmed over 12 years. Whoa,
Yeah.
that must have been hard to pull off. How did they even do that?
It shows just how dedicated the director and everyone involved was. They filmed for a few days each year, and they captured the actors as they actually grew up. It's a totally unique way of making a movie, and it took a lot of patience.
And that's what's so inspiring about these low-budget success stories. It's not just about being clever with money. It's about having a vision, a passion for the story, and being willing to push the limits of what's possible.
It's about realizing that filmmaking is really about connecting with an audience on an emotional level, and you can do that no matter what your budget is,
Yeah.
as long as the story's good and the characters are relatable.
So we're seeing that budget is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
It's the story, the characters, the way it's filmed, and even how it's marketed. All those things come together to make a film successful.
Exactly. And these low-budget successes, they show us that sometimes those limitations can lead to some of the most creative and innovative films.
This has been such a great conversation so far. We've seen how films like Rocky, Halloween, The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity, Napoleon Dynamite, Moonlight, and Boyhood all did amazingly well, even with really small budgets. And we've started to understand why they were so successful. But there's still so much more to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. We're just getting started.
We are. When we come back, we're going to dive deeper into some of these films. We'll look at the specific things they did to overcome their budget problems and create these amazing movie experiences.
I'm excited.
Me too. And we'll also look at some other genres where low-budget films have really done well.
Right, because it's not just horror.
No, not at all. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We've been talking about all these awesome low-budget films that really surprised everyone. I'm curious about something, like how did these filmmakers approach certain genres, when they had to work with such small budgets? Oh, that's a good question. Like sci-fi, for example. It's a genre that's all about like visuals and special effects.
Right, lots of CGI and stuff.
Exactly. And those can be expensive. But even so, there's some really creative sci-fi films that were made on tiny budgets.
Yeah, what's funny is that we always think about sci-fi as needing, like, giant spaceships and crazy effects.
Right.
But honestly, some of my favorite sci-fi films are more about the human element,
Yeah.
within these fantastical settings.
Totally. Like Primer, for example.
Primer.
It was made in 2004 for only $7,000. And it's like a really mind-bending time travel story, but focuses more on like complex ideas and the characters, rather than just visuals. The director, Shane Carruth, he actually used his background in math and engineering to make this film. So it's like smart and emotional at the same time.
I remember watching Primer and being like, whoa.
Right.
It's so complex and original. It just shows that you don't need a ton of money to make a really thought-provoking sci-fi film.
No, you don't. And Primer is a great example of how a small budget can actually make filmmakers be more creative. They had to find clever ways to like show these complex scientific ideas and the time travel stuff. But they did it through dialogue and editing, and just a really simple visual style.
Okay, so Primer proves you can do sci-fi on a tiny budget. But what about films that deal with, like, social issues? Movies that bring up important themes but might not have the money that a big studio would give.
Yeah, that's a really important area where independent filmmaking really shines. Like take Clerks, for instance.
Clerks, okay.
This 1994 black and white comedy. They shot it for only $27,575.
Wow.
And it became a cult classic.
Yeah, it did.
Because it was so honest and funny about the lives of these convenience store workers. It really captured how it feels to be a young adult, all those frustrations and anxieties, and it resonated with a lot of people.
Clerks definitely broke the mold. It felt so real and authentic, like you're just peering into the lives of these people. And it showed that sometimes the best stories are just about ordinary life.
And it totally challenged the way things were usually done. The director, Kevin Smith, he actually shot Clerks in the same convenience store where he worked.
Oh, really?
And he used his friends as the actors. So that kind of guerrilla filmmaking, it gave the film this gritty realism. And you couldn't get that with a big budget and a polished Hollywood look.
And that's the kind of authenticity that really connects with people. They see themselves in the characters.
Exactly.
And their struggles. It's like the more personal it is, the more universal it becomes.
Yeah, when you tap into those shared human experiences, the budget doesn't really matter anymore. It's the emotional truth that makes it powerful.
So we've seen how filmmakers have tackled like sci-fi, comedy, and those films with social commentary all on a tight budget. But what about those really epic stories? The ones that usually need like huge landscapes and tons of extras.
Those are definitely more challenging. But even with limitations, some filmmakers have found really creative ways to make it feel big and grand without spending a fortune.
You're talking about movies like Mad Max, Fury Road, right? That film was so epic, the action sequences were incredible, but I remember reading that they made it in a pretty small budget for what they achieved visually.
Yeah, Mad Max Fury Road is a great example of how practical effects and smart filmmaking can rival those big CGI blockbusters. The director, George Miller, he chose to do real stunts and use real vehicles as much as possible.
Oh, I loved that about the film.
So it created this really visceral experience, and it felt unique.
Yeah, the car chases and explosions, they felt so real and intense.
Yeah.
And it just added to that whole gritty post-apocalyptic world.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the action. They used clever camera angles and editing to make the world feel vast and huge, even though they were filming in limited locations. They knew that visual storytelling is as much about how you frame the shot as it is about what's actually in the shot.
That attention to detail and that creative problem solving, it's so impressive.
It really is.
They really push the limits of what you can do with a small budget.
Mad Max Fury Road is a testament to the filmmaker's ingenuity and vision. They took those limitations and they turned them into strengths. And they made a film that was both visually stunning and had a great story.
It seems like there's a common thread running through all these low-budget successes,
Yeah.
like a willingness to embrace those constraints and come up with creative solutions. And that often leads to a kind of rawness and authenticity that really connects with audiences.
I think you're right. It's like the limitations themselves force filmmakers to be more resourceful and ingenious and really passionate about the story they're telling.
It's like a reminder that filmmaking at its core is about connecting with an audience, sharing a story, and making people feel something. And you can do that with any budget, as long as you have the vision and the talent to bring it to life.
Exactly. These films are proof that it's not about how much money you have. It's about the power of the story and the skill of the filmmakers.
This has been such a great conversation. We've looked at so many different genres and seen how filmmakers have used their creativity to overcome budget limitations. And they made some truly impactful films. But there's one genre we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, what is it?
Musicals. Is it even possible to make a good musical on a low budget?
Hmm. That's a good question. Musicals often have like elaborate sets and costumes and dancing, which can be pretty expensive to produce.
Mhm.
But there are some really cool examples of musicals that did it with limited resources.
So we've seen how filmmakers have tackled sci-fi horror comedy, even those epic action movies, all on a shoestring budget.
Hmm.
But what about musicals? Can you really make a good musical without spending a ton of money?
You might be surprised. Yeah, musicals often make you think of big stage productions and fancy dance numbers. But there are some really innovative and heartwarming musicals that were made on a tiny budget, like Once, for
Oh,
example.
Once. Yeah, that's a great one. It was so simple but so moving. What was it about Once that made it work so well,
Yeah.
even with such a small budget?
Well, Once was filmed in 2007 for only $150,000. And it's a testament to how powerful authentic storytelling can be and how raw emotion can be conveyed through music. It's just a simple love story between two musicians in Dublin, and it's told through their original songs.
I loved how the music in Once felt so natural to the story. It wasn't about being flashy or anything. It was about the emotions and the connection between the characters.
Exactly. They used the music to tell the story. So the characters' emotions came out through their songs, and the actors were also the musicians, which made the performances feel even more real and intimate.
It's like they say limitations can actually make you more creative.
Yeah, when you have limitations, you have to find creative solutions, and sometimes that leads to something really special.
Once proves that you don't need a ton of money to make a really powerful musical experience. It's about capturing those raw emotions and the human connection through music and storytelling. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how filmmakers have done amazing things across all these different genres, and they did it all while working with small budgets. What are some of the key takeaways? You know, the things you think our listeners should remember.
Well, the biggest thing is that these films show us that the budget is just one part of filmmaking. It's the story, the characters, the director's vision, the technical skills of the crew, and the passion that really make a film great.
And we've seen how limitations can sometimes actually be a good thing.
Yeah, they can.
They force filmmakers to be more resourceful and innovative and really focus on the heart of their story.
Absolutely. These low-budget successes, they're encouraging. They tell us to think outside the box, to challenge the way things are usually done, and to remember that great storytelling can come from anywhere.
And for anyone out there who wants to make films, this is a really empowering message. You don't need a huge Hollywood budget to make something special. If these filmmakers can achieve so much on a shoestring budget, imagine what you can do with passion, a great story, and a bit of that resourceful indie spirit.
Yet don't let limitations hold you back. Embrace the challenge, find creative solutions, and let your passion guide you.
This has been such an inspiring conversation. We've explored all these different films,
Yeah.
and each one shows that you can make great cinema on any budget. But there's one area we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, you're right. What is
We
it?
haven't talked about animated films. Those could be super expensive to make. You need tons of artists and animators. So how do low-budget animated films even exist?
That's a great point. Animation does seem like it would be really expensive. How do those films get made without big studio support?
Well, it takes a different kind of creativity and a willingness to try different approaches to animation, like Persepolis, for example. It's a 2007 French-Iranian animated film. It's a biography and a drama, and it was made on a budget of $7.3 million, which is still pretty small for animation.
Persepolis.
And it's a powerful and moving story about a young girl growing up in Iran during the Islamic Revolution.
Persepolis is such a visually stunning film. I remember the animation style being so unique and expressive. What made it stand out from other animated films, especially considering its budget?
The filmmakers chose to use this black and white animation style, and it was really striking visually, but it was also a lot cheaper to do. They focused on telling a strong story visually, and they used powerful imagery and line work instead of like fancy character movements or special effects.
Like they embraced the fact that they had a limited budget,
Hmm.
and they turned it into a stylistic choice. And that actually made the film even more emotional. Exactly. Persepolis shows that animation doesn't have to be expensive to be powerful. They focused on good storytelling and a unique visual style. And they created a film that was both beautiful to look at and emotionally resonant.
It's a great example of how thinking differently can lead to really cool and innovative results,
Yeah.
even in a genre that's usually seen as expensive.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes us rethink what's possible in animation. Low-budget animated films can be just as impactful and engaging as the ones that cost a ton of money.
And that brings us back to the main message we've been talking about. It's not about the money. It's about the passion. the vision and the storytelling.
Right. These low-budget successes remind us that great filmmaking can happen no matter what your budget is. It's about the human stories we tell and how we connect with audiences through the magic of cinema.
This has been such an inspiring and insightful conversation.
Oh,
We've
good.
covered so many different genres, from sports dramas to sci-fi thrillers, from horror flicks to animated masterpieces,
Yeah.
and all of them show that you can make great cinema on any budget.
We've seen how limitations can actually spark creativity, how resourcefulness can lead to amazing results, and how the power of storytelling can overcome any financial obstacle.
But before we wrap up, I want to talk about something we haven't really addressed directly. It's something that often goes hand in hand with low-budget filmmaking.
You mean like taking risks and experimenting?
Exactly. When you don't have a lot of money to fall back on, you're often more likely to take creative risks and try new things.
That's a really good point. Low-budget filmmaking can be like a breeding ground for innovation.
Yeah, like a testing ground.
Filmmakers are more willing to push the boundaries to try new things and challenge the rules because they have less to lose.
It's like they have this freedom to explore their vision without all the pressure and expectations that come with a big budget production.
Right. They can be more playful, more adventurous, and more willing to take chances, things that might not be possible in a more commercial environment.
And that often leads to films that feel fresh and original
Yeah.
and really unique.
Exactly. They break free from the formulas and offer new perspectives. They challenge audiences to think differently and experience cinema in new ways.
So it seems like low-budget filmmaking isn't just about having a small budget. It's about a certain mindset, a willingness to experiment, to take risks, and to push the limits of what's possible.
Absolutely. And that spirit of innovation and experimentation, that's often what leads to those really groundbreaking moments in cinema. Those films that change genres, challenge the way things are done, and leave a lasting impression on audiences.
This has been an amazing deep dive into the world of low-budget filmmaking. We've discovered some hidden gems, explored these creative triumphs, and learned that great filmmaking can happen on any budget.
We've seen how limitations can inspire innovation, how resourcefulness can lead to amazing results, and how the power of storytelling can overcome financial constraints.
But before we finish up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Yeah.
Think about those films that you might have skipped over because they didn't have a big budget.
Yeah, maybe it's time to give them another look. Look beyond the surface and see what stories they have to tell. You might be surprised by how deep, creative, and emotionally impactful they are.
This is where we'll pause our exploration for now. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. When we come back, we want to hear from you, the listener. We'll invite you to share your own thoughts and discoveries about low-budget filmmaking. We're back. And, we've spent all this time talking about how these low-budget films found success and why. But now I really want to know what you thought.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on all the technical stuff and the tricks they used, but in the end, it's all about what the audience takes away from it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, listener, what low-budget film really surprised you? Was it one we talked about today or something else entirely? What was it about that film that you just weren't expecting?
Maybe it was a film you thought wouldn't be good because of the budget, and then you watched it, and it turned out to be this hidden gem with an awesome story and characters you really connected with.
Yeah, like maybe you were blown away by those practical effects in Mad Max Fury Road, or the way moonlight just hits you in the feels.
Or maybe it was a smaller film that not a lot of people know about, but it just really resonated with you. It proves that a film doesn't need a huge budget to be great.
It's crazy how our ideas about films are often shaped by things like how much they spent on marketing or who the big stars are.
We tend to think that if a film had a big budget, it must be good. But as we've seen today, that's not always true. Some of the most powerful and memorable films were made with very little money. They relied on creativity, passion, and a real understanding of how to tell a good story.
And that's where you come in, listener. When you share your own discoveries and what you think, it helps us all understand what makes a film truly great, no matter the budget.
So tell us, what low-budget film made you change your mind? Which one surprised you with how deep, original, or emotional it was?
Don't be shy. We want to hear about those hidden gems, those underdog films that beat the odds and grabbed your attention.
And as you think about your own experiences with these films, think about this. Do you think having a limited budget can sometimes actually lead to more creative and impactful filmmaking?
It's a really interesting question. Does working within those constraints force filmmakers to be more resourceful, more innovative, and more connected to the heart of their story?
Or do those limitations sometimes hold them back, and the film ends up feeling like it's missing something?
There's no easy answer, and that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating. It's about understanding that filmmaking is this complex art form, and it's influenced by so many things, including the budget, but ultimately is driven by the passion and vision of the people making it.
And it reminds us that there's always something new to discover, more hidden gems to find, more stories waiting to be told, and none of that depends on having a ton of money.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning your assumptions, and keep looking for those cinematic treasures that might be hiding in plain sight.
And remember, the next time you see a film with a small budget, don't just write it off, give it a chance. You might be really surprised by what you find.
And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to create your own low-budget masterpiece, proving that cinematic brilliance can happen anywhere, even on a shoestring budget.
That's right. And until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.